People are vanishing in our national forests and national parks all over the world. And in today's episode, we're going to be focusing specifically around a rather sinister section of the country, the Michigan Triangle. This area alone could have an entire series on it because it's so bizarre and strange, but the cases I'll be talking about today will make you rethink ever stepping foot in this state again. You won't want to miss this one. On May 26, 2013, Cullen Finnerty, a 30-year-old former quarterback who had led the Grand Valley State University to 3 NCAA Division II football championships, went on a fishing trip with his brother-in-law and father-in-law on Michigan's Baldwin River. But little did they know, this seemingly innocent outing would turn into a mystery that still remains unsolved. Cullen was a hometown hero. He was born and raised in Brighton, Michigan. He had a stellar high school football career, earning awards and accolades that would make any parent proud. But his real glory days were at the Grand Valley State, where he led the team to an astonishing 3 national titles. He even had a taste of the NFL, spending time with the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos. But one day in May, something went wrong. The plan was simple. Cullen's in-laws would drop him off of the river and he'd float downstream on his pontoon boat, and they'd then pick him up about 30 minutes later. But when they arrived at the designated spot, Cullen was nowhere to be found. And then a chilling phone call. Cullen, who was in sheer panic, told his family he was being chased by something. And so he fled into the woods, desperate to escape whatever was coming after him, and then silence. The phone goes dead, and Cullen was never heard from again. Now, can you picture how freaked out he must have sounded? Like the pure panic, the deep down dread of him being chased by something he couldn't see? I mean, it's got to be like the worst kind of bad dream you could possibly think of. But for Cullen, this was no dream. This was his reality in those last crazy, horrific moments. And so a frantic search ensued, police and volunteers combing a square-mile area of this dense woodland. But it wasn't until 2 days later, on May 28th, that they found Cullen's body, just a mile from where he had vanished. But here's the thing. There were no signs of trauma, no indication of a struggle, and he was very well dressed for the elements, as if he had simply just laid down and never gotten back up. Well, unfortunately, there was an autopsy done, and the autopsy didn't provide the closure that everybody had hoped for. In fact, the picture it painted was far stranger. It suggested that Cullen, alone and disoriented in the woods, had succumbed to some sort of fatal combination of anxiety, paranoia, and an elevated level of oxycodone in his system. And so the medical examiner also noted the possibility of CTE, the brain disease that has plagued so many football players. And it's like every time we think we have a handle on what happened to Cullen, there's some new piece of information that comes to light that would just throw everything into question. Now, first, it's the oxycodone and the CTE and a seemingly clear-cut case of a mind pushed to the brink. But then the Boston University researchers come in and say, not so fast, because the CTE they claim wasn't severe enough to cause Cullen's death on its own. So where does that leave us? Well, right back at square one, with far more questions than answers, and this gnawing sense that there's something more to this story than meets the eye. But folks, the story doesn't end there. Because months later, researchers at the Boston University took a closer look at his brain, and what they found cast doubt on all initial theories. Yes, Cullen had CTE, but the severity was only moderate. Unlikely, they said, to have caused his death all on its own. So what really happened in those woods? Was he truly the victim of his own mind, a man pushed to the brink of pain, paranoia, and maybe the lingering effects of too many hits to the head in football? Or was there something more sinister at play? maybe something that chased him to his death in the Michigan wilderness. Now, Cullen's family may never know for sure, and even his father noted that only the people that will know what happened will be between him and God. But one thing is for certain, is that the mystery of Cullen Finnerty's final horrors will probably never be solved. And interestingly, this also wasn't the first time that Cullen had experienced a paranoid episode, because apparently in early 2012, instead of driving home to Detroit, he suddenly took off for Grand Rapids, convinced the FBI was following him, and his wife Jennifer said this state of panic lasted for almost 5 entire days. And then there was the matter of Cullen's medication. You see, he had been prescribed oxycodone for severe back pain and was also taking a thyroid medication. His father couldn't help but wonder if those high doses had left him sick and confused, and wandering those woods in this kind of thick, foggy haze. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of this entire case is what Cullen had said in that final call. Now, he claimed he was being chased, stalked by some unknown entity. So was this merely a figment of a mind unraveling, or had he just stumbled upon something truly terrifying in the woods? Now, some have speculated that his football career and the countless smacks to the head did play a role in his death. I mean, CTE, the brain disease found in many athletes, can lead to aggression, confusion, and depression. But many people think there's a lot more going on here than what the public is being led on to believe, which means we're left with more questions than answers. And of course, the police were very quick to write it off as a simple case of drug toxicity and brain trauma. But was it really? Because if this was the case, then who was chasing him? Now, lastly, I do want to say this, that I think it's interesting, in addition to everything, the location of this took place right next to the Manistee National Forest, which already has a multitude of missing persons cases. It's this vast wilderness spanning many square miles, dense forest, winding rivers, and even hidden caves. A perfect place, some might say, for something or someone to lurk unseen. Now, this area of the woods where this happened is thick, tangled underbrush, towering trees that just seem to stretch on forever, and so it's really no wonder it took searchers 2 full days to even find him, and even then, it was almost by chance. I mean, stumbling upon his body in a spot barely a mile from where he'd vanished, it makes you wonder what could have driven him so deep into those woods, to a place where he couldn't be found until it was too late. And it's not just Cullen, because over the years, countless others have vanished in these same woods, never to be seen again. Hikers, campers, even experienced outdoorsmen, all just seemingly swallowed up by the forest, leaving behind nothing but questions. So could there be a connection between Cullen's death and these other disappearances? Is there something in those woods, something that preys on the lost and the vulnerable? It's a chilling thought, and one that has really affected families of the missing for decades. But let's not forget the most important aspect of this entire video and this case: the human toll of tragedy. Cullen was really an amazing individual, and from his family and friends, this was a guy who was very kind, very generous, full of life. He loved his family, loved faith, and of course, football. I mean, like all of us, he had his own demons that he battled, yes, but he was right on the cusp of embracing such a bright future, and unfortunately, that was tragically taken away from him. Even more tragic is that Cullen's fate will probably remain a mystery. On October 17th, 2019, Adrian Ada Quintal, a 47-year-old woman from Southfield, Detroit, was staying at her family's cabin in the small village of Honor, Michigan. Now, she had been fixing up the place for about 3 weeks with her boyfriend, but he had headed back to Detroit for a couple of days earlier on October 15th. And so the cabin had actually been in Ada's family for around 75 years now, and was located right on Indian Hill Road, which is roughly 250 miles west of her home in Detroit. And so while working on the cabin, Ada was also getting ready for hunting season and just enjoying the beautiful wildlife in the area. Her son, Nick White, who was only 27 at the time, had even stopped by to drop off some supplies and later said that his mom seemed to be in relatively good spirits. But in the early hours of October 17th, right around 2:30 in the morning, Ada made a bizarre and frantic call to a friend in Warren. And it was how she sounded and what she was saying that was all wrong. She was scared and panicked, telling her friend that she saw people outside the cabin. And the friend tried to pry for more information, but the call ended abruptly. And now, completely worried sick, the friend calls 911 and informs police exactly what Ada had said, and that she potentially was involved in a shootout with two men and had even shot one of them in the face. Now, the friend tried calling Ada back right after contacting the police, but the call went straight to voicemail. And so the sheriffs and authorities get out there, and by this time it's about 3:15 in the morning, and they didn't find like a typical violent scene. What they found was very bizarre. There were bullet holes in one of the windows and shell casings on the ground that seemed to be from different guns, but there was no sign of Ada or anyone else around. Now, the police did search the area using canine units and thermal imaging cameras, but they couldn't find a single person. And what's more is the bullet holes suggested that someone had fired a gun from inside the cabin, shooting outward. But according to the Benzie County Sheriff, Ted Schendel, there was no blood or signs of a struggle inside or outside the cabin. So there was really no evidence that anyone had actually ever been shot. Now, as the police investigated further, this just got more and more weird. They actually found Ada's boots and cell phone on the roof of the cabin. Man, if this isn't sounding like something out of a missing 411 book, then I don't know what is. So how did those end up there? And near the cabin, under some leaves, they discovered Ada's 9mm gun, her purse, credit cards, and keys. It was like she had just tossed her belongings around the property. Now, had she been kidnapped or did she disappear on her own? Like, what's going on here? Clearly, the authorities were stumped, and Benzie County Under Sheriff Kyle Rosa just pretty much said that they did not see any evidence of there being another party out there shooting back at her or even doing things that were originally described, and that he couldn't even explain it, and they weren't sure what her state of mind was like at the time, whether it maybe was a medical emergency or what, but they do feel that she was there the entire time. Now, at first, the police weren't exactly sure if Ada was missing by choice or if she really was in danger. And they even questioned her boyfriend and considered him a suspect before ultimately releasing him without any charges. And so the search for Ada was on, and it was pretty intense. And so Michigan State Police and Benzie County search and rescue teams would scour the area, focusing in and around the cabin, and specifically a half-mile radius from where Ada was last seen. You know, they used sniffer dogs and drones, and at least 20 people were involved, including but not limited to Ada's friends and family. But despite their efforts, there was no trace of her ever found, actually. And in December of 2019, they even brought in cadaver dogs to try and aid with the search. And Honor, the village where Ada's cabin was located, is a very tiny place. I mean, we're talking like a little over 300 people. And it's actually only about 20 miles south of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore and roughly 25 miles west of Traverse City. Now, the area is very well known for its beautiful and outdoor activities, but it's also very remote and very heavily wooded. And so anyway, 9.5 weeks after Ada's disappearance on December 21st, 2019, her family makes a devastating discovery. Because at around 1:30 p.m., they do find a body in a flooded area roughly 300 to 400 yards away from the cabin. It was on the family's property in a branch of the North Platte River, submerged in about 3 feet of water. The area where the body was found was pretty rugged and very densely wooded, which would have made it extremely difficult for any authorities or search and rescue to try and go in there and retrieve it. And in fact, the family had been conducting their own search with trained search and rescue teams when they too stumbled upon the body. Now, they had never stopped looking for Ada during those long 9.5 weeks. So based on scars and a tattoo, the body was unfortunately identified as Adrian Quintal. Now, Kyle Rosa from the Benzie County Sheriff's Office claimed that from what they could see upon their initial contact and recovery, they unfortunately did not see anything that would have indicated foul play or a cause of death at the time. And even Ada's sister, Jenny Bryson, had expressed the family's heartbreak and would claim that this search was not over, that they have never stopped searching for Ada, and are clearly heartbroken as the search did not have a positive ending. Now, months before her disappearance, she had actually suffered a head injury, and then police and her family speculated that a medical issue might have been to blame for her strange behavior that night. And so the Benzie County Sheriff's Office would later determine that Ada's death was caused by the combined toxic effects of methamphetamine and diazepam, with hyperthermia also playing a role. Now, interestingly, Ada did have a long history of mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, and her family and friends knew she had been struggling, but they never expected something like this to happen. In fact, just a few weeks before her disappearance, Ada had confided in her sister Jenny that she was feeling overwhelmed and needed a break from the stress of everyday life. Now, that's part of the reason why she had decided to go and spend some time at this cabin, hoping to just clear her head and find some solace and peace. But as the investigation continued to unfold, it became more and more clear that her mental state might have played a very significant role in those events on that bizarre night. The methamphetamine found in her system was actually a shock to everybody that knew her because she wasn't ever one to use hard drugs, and some speculated that she might have turned to abuse as a way to cope with some inner turmoil that she was dealing with. And the head injury, had it somehow affected her behavior or decision-making abilities? The family wondered if the injury, combined with her pre-existing mental health issues and the possible drug abuse, had maybe put her in some vulnerable state to, a psychosis. Now, additionally, even though Ada's disappearance didn't happen within a national park, the area where she vanished is part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And what's even worse than that is, just like in the case of Cullen Finnerty, a college football player who went missing in 2013, Ada's cabin was located not too far away from the Manistee National Forest. And so with Ada's case bearing similarities to Cullen's, you have the proximity to the National Forest and the strange circumstances surrounding their disappearances. It does make you wonder that could there be more to what we're looking at than what we've been told. But sadly, her death was ultimately ruled an accident, and the exact circumstances that surround that fateful night remain a mystery. Now, in my opinion, this story is easily the strangest out of all of these, and that's mainly because of what happens later on in the story. Now, in February of 1978, Stephen Kubaki embarked on a solo skiing trip to Lake Michigan, an area that he had visited many times before. And in fact, Stephen Kubaki was an enthusiastic lover of the outdoors who enjoyed hiking, and he had even climbed mountains while studying in Europe. And so, after telling everyone where he was going and what he was going to be doing, well, that was just the last anybody had ever heard from Steve, at least for the time being. Now, the day after Steve's trip, and snowmobilers in Saugatuck had spotted cross-country skis that were abandoned with a backpack, and so they contacted the authorities to report a missing person. Well, they quickly found out that the contents of the pack belonged to Steve, and a search and rescue mission was immediately started. But here's the thing. The only clue they had was a 200-yard trail of footprints in the snow leading past the edge of the lake, which ended abruptly. Now, this led investigators to conclude that Steve had clearly fallen through the ice to his death, either by drowning or hypothermia. However, detectives who investigated Steve's disappearance weren't entirely convinced that he had gone under the ice, and that was mainly because they just failed to find a body. And so they would then send his dental records to Chicago to try and see if Steve might be among the serial killer John Wayne Gacy's unidentified victims, but still no luck in that. And so all they could do was really conclude that on February 20th of 1978, 23-year-old Stephen Kubaki had vanished into thin air while on a solo cross-country skiing trip right near Saugatuck to a town close to the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. Now, this is where things get weird. The Lake Michigan Triangle, the area where Steve disappeared, has been the site of many unexplained disasters and shipwrecks over the years. I mean, people have come up with all sorts of possible explanations for these strange events, including UFOs, weather events, and even time portals. Now, take the case of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501, for example. On June 23, 1950, the flight was headed from New York City to Seattle with 58 people on board. But when it was over the Lake Michigan Triangle, Captain Robert Lind radioed in to request permission to descend to 2,500 feet due to a severe electrical storm and high winds. But permission was denied, and then the radar went dark with no further communication from Lind. And sadly, Flight 2501 never arrived in Seattle. It had simply vanished. And so they would scour and search Lake Michigan for wreckage immediately, but they found nothing. Human remains then began to wash up on the shore of the lake in the days following, but the plane itself had never been found, despite yearly searches funded by the thriller author Clive Cussler and undertaken by the Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates. And there were even bizarre reports of bright lights over the lake on the same night as Flight 2501 disappeared. But that's a story for another video. Let's get back to Steve real quick. 15 months after he had gone missing, on Saturday, May 5th, 1979, this is kind of the kicker here, right? Steve would reappear in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, of all places, 700 miles east from Lake Michigan, mind you. And if you're ready for the ultimate kicker, he had no memory of the year and a quarter he had been missing. And Steve had even claimed himself that he didn't immediately realize how much time had passed until he had bought a newspaper and he actually saw the date. And so eventually he would find his way to his aunt's house in Great Barrington, which is only roughly 20 miles from Pittsfield, and then he was successfully reunited with his family in South Deerfield. And so when Steve did reappear, all he had with him was $40 in cash, new glasses, sneakers, and a t-shirt from a marathon in Wisconsin, clothes he didn't recognize as his own. He also had a backpack filled with maps and hitchhiking signs from places like San Francisco, Sacramento, Reno, Utah, and Chicago. And even stranger, in an interview in the days after he reappeared, he even claimed that he said that he felt like he's done a lot of running. And his memory right up until his disappearance remained intact, and he said the last thing he could remember was feeling cold and scared. And he believed his memory loss was caused by exhaustion and exposure, and he planned to actually see a medical doctor for a physical, but he wouldn't be seeing a psychiatrist. Now, Steve also made it clear that he was in very good mental health when he set off for the skiing trip, and claimed that his father was actually going to sign over the house to Steve because he only had 3 courses at school and, well, no trouble. And he even left a romance in Germany. There was no trouble with girls. He had a good job lined up with the Holland Sentinel newspaper. I mean, he had all of his ducks in a row, so to speak. Now, a little bit about Steve is that he grew up in South Deerfield, Massachusetts, which is kind of a lower middle class family. His dad worked in a tire factory, his mom was a secretary at the University of Massachusetts, and he graduated from Deerfield Academy in 1972 as a day student and then headed off to Hope College. Now, speaking of school, Steve was also a student at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, which is a private Christian university, and when he went missing, he was only months away from graduating that spring. Bob Namar, who was a 1978 Hope graduate who didn't know Steve personally, but had heard about him after the disappearance, claimed that Steve was actually described as a brilliant man, a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons, and a little more free-spirited than your average student at a very conservative school, which would explain at the time why he chose to live off campus. Now, after going on to have just a bunch of successes and getting a lot of degrees because the dude's a flipping brainiac, he actually practiced in Seattle as a psychologist, providing psychotherapy and consulting services since 1993 for adults, adolescents, children, couples, and families. And even after that, the dude went on to have a bunch more successes, even writing his own book. And so interestingly, for many years, Steve refused to speak about his disappearance with the media, and he ignored repeated requests for interviews by journalists, and his parents, who reportedly spent thousands of dollars on a PI after he went missing, have now unfortunately passed away. Because back in 1979, Steve had actually told reporters that he was going to try and retrace his steps to try and piece together where he had been when he was gone, but it's unknown whether he actually undertook this journey or not. So that leads a lot of us to ask what really happened to Steve during those 15 months he was missing. Was he a victim of the mysterious Lake Michigan Triangle, or was there some other explanation? I guess we may never know for sure, but one thing's for certain is that Steve's disappearance and reappearance is one heck of a mystery that's left a lot of people scratching their heads over the years. Unfortunately, the truth of what happened to him all those years ago remains inconclusive. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below Michigan Triangle, so that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys are fans of storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, you should totally go ahead and smack that big like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.